I want to welcome all of you. It's really a pleasure to be with you. My name is Micah Streiffer. I am the founder and director of La'asok. La'asok is a virtual liberal Beit Midrash. It's a place to come together to study Jewish texts as liberal Jews in order to build our connection with, our knowledge of, and our ownership over our Judaism, and to do so together as Jews always do in community. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to spend the next hour talking about a subject that I think speaks to our Judaism in a lot of different ways, which is the question of, does God really hear our prayers, and does it matter? So let's open with a blessing. Jewish study always begins with a blessing, and if you're able, I'd like to invite you to unmute and to join me in the blessing for study. We'll say together, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'divrei Torah. Blessed is the one whose mitzvot, whose commandments bring holiness to our lives, and who commands us to immerse ourselves, to engage ourselves in words of Torah. The word la'asok, which is of course the name of our organization, means to immerse or to engage, because as Jews, that's what we do when we enter into Torah. We're not just here to hear the words or even just to learn the words, but rather to immerse, to engage, to soak ourselves in the words of Torah. So I'd like to start with a joke, as all good study sessions should begin. And the joke goes like this, that one night, two rabbis stay up all night, arguing, debating, discussing, and by the end of the night, they have definitively disproved the existence of God. That is, they have proved that there is no God by the end of the night. The next morning, one of the rabbis wakes up, and he sees the other rabbi across the street coming out of the shul with his tefillin and his talit in hand. He says, "What are you doing with your talit and tefillin? What are you doing coming out of the shul? I thought we just proved last night that God doesn't exist." The other rabbi, talit in hand, looks back at him and says, "So what does that have to do with anything?" So in Judaism has often been a multi-generational discussion about the question of what is God and how does God relate to our prayers. In a minute, I'm going to talk about a bit of a disconnect between the way we maybe think about God and the way we talk about God in our prayers. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you to engage in a little exercise with me. The exercise is as follows. I'd like to ask you, we're going to use the chat for this, to talk about first what Judaism teaches about God, and then what we believe about God. So starting with, I want to go the other way around here. Starting with what Judaism teaches. Let's do this. Judaism teaches that God is. If I can ask you to just finish that sentence into the chat. I see omnipotent. I see creator of the universe. I see is, that God exists, right? A voice for moral propriety. Oh, Robert, that is a whole other class that I'd like to engage in. The creator of life. End of sentence. God is one, a single being, creator of everything. The word judgment. God is judgment and maybe judgmental if you read the Torah closely enough. And I see the word one coming up over and over again. These are all words that are found within our traditional prayer book. God's oneness, God as creator, God as revealer of Torah, writing Torah, commanding things, God within us as well. Now let's move on to a different question. Let's finish this one, please. I believe God is what? And now I see some words coming up, some of which are similar and some of which are different. I see the language of energy, source of all life. I want to point out that a source of life is maybe different than a creator of life. And we can talk about what the difference is between those two things. God within us, God is our moral compass. End of sentence. Rabbi Goldberg, you put the same thing twice. God is, right? I'm with you. I like what you did there. What we put out into the world that makes it a better place. That's a very interesting idea. Energy, the creator of good stories, holy, able to help me, able to drive me insane and a half. I'd like to know more about that. God as a part of everything, connected consciousness. God as the life force within us that recognizes the life force within us and their sanctity and inviolability. The harmony we humans seek and a partner. So I would love to spend the next hour talking only about the things that you said, because we have so many different interesting ideas about God here. And yet, what I want to point out from what we put in the chat is that there's a little bit of a disconnect here. Not a total disconnect, but something of a disconnect between what we say Judaism teaches about God versus what we believe or what we connect with in God. When we talk about Judaism's teachings about God, we often talk about God as a creator or as a judge or as an outside someone who is doing things, commanding us, teaching us, creating the world. When we talk about our own beliefs about God, the language suddenly changes. It softens a little bit. We talk about the notion of God within us. We talk about the notion of God as an energy, maybe something we can tap into, something that we participate in. Somebody talked about harmony and partnership and connection. So our individual notions of God sometimes differ from what we think Judaism teaches about God. And that's important because if we can't see ourselves in the words of the page, and the page here being the page of the prayer book, then we have a hard time connecting what we're doing in prayer with what it is that we actually believe or connect to. And that disconnect is actually most clear in the words of almost every blessing we ever recite. So I don't know if everybody reads Hebrew here. I imagine some of you read Hebrew and some don't. But what we have in front of us here are words that most of you can recite by heart, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. Even if you don't know what they mean, you know those words most likely, right? So I want to use these 6 words as a little bit of a text study to understand this disconnect more between what we believe about God or how we connect with God and what we say about God when we have the words of the prayer book in front of us. So first of all, the word Baruch. Now, I set this up as a kind of you can see that each word points to a translation on the other side. So the word Baruch means blessed. What does it mean? I'll ask you if you have a comment or a thought, you can either put it into the chat or you can raise your hand and I'm happy to call on people. What does it mean when we say God is blessed? What are we saying? What issues does it raise up? What questions does it raise when we say God is Baruch, God is blessed? Any thoughts on that? I see in the chat, holy and not to be forsaken. And I see also a comment from Susan, I find absolutely nothing in the prayer book, only the prayers I create find meaningful. I think that's a fair criticism. That's in some ways the disconnect that I want to address right now. So the question of seen as holy by others, Amy puts into the chat. One of the challenges around the word Baruch is the question of, can we bless God? What does it mean for us to say that God is blessed? Do we have the power to bless God? Is God even somebody for us to bless? Is God a being out there that we can bestow blessing upon? And yet in our prayer book, we say that God is Baruch. The other thing that's less clear in the English than in the Hebrew is that the word Baruch is quite gendered. Anyone who reads Hebrew, who understands Hebrew, you hear the word Baruch, you know that you're talking to who? To a man, right? So when I say Baruch Atah, blessed are you, as a Hebrew speaker, I feel that I am speaking to a man and calling him blessed. I am bestowing blessing upon a person or a man whose name perhaps is God. So let's talk about this name Adonai. First of all, how do you pronounce that? Is a trick question, right? Because obviously we don't know how it's pronounced. It is most definitely not pronounced Adonai, at least originally, because those aren't the letters of it. This, of course, Yud He Vav He is the intimate name of God as expressed in the Torah. I had a professor in rabbinical school, actually a TA, a teacher's assistant in rabbinical school, Jeff Cooley, who used to say that this is like calling God Kevin. This is God's proper name, as opposed to the word Elohim or Eloheinu, which means God, as sort of like a job title. So it's interesting to think about as well the notion that God might have a name. To have a name, that would imply a being, right? And almost a person, although not actually a person, but an entity out there called God, called Adonai, that we are referring to when we say our prayers. Also worth noting that the word Adon or Adonai actually means Lord, which again is quite gendered language, that when we stop to think about God, how many of us really think about God as a Lord, as a commanding Lord, versus other images about God? Moving on in our blessing here, we have the word Eloheinu. Eloheinu means our God, which again, I think the challenge in the word Eloheinu is the notion of God as an object. God as someone out there who can be ours is different from a notion of God as collective consciousness, as somebody put into the chat, or God as the totality of all that is, God as someone or something that we all participate in. Again, our language here makes God into an object or a person that we may not necessarily believe that God is. Which brings me to the last two words on here, which is maybe in some ways the most problematic. What does Melech HaOlam mean in Hebrew? It means, well, literally, king of the world. So for those, again, who read Hebrew, who understand Hebrew, to call God Melech HaOlam, we sort of explain it away in our English by saying like sovereign of the universe, right? Sometimes in English, you can say things that are more egalitarian feeling than the Hebrew, source of the universe. There's lots of ways to say it, but what it ultimately means actually is ruler or king of the world. And so as you look at these words, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, blessed are you, Lord, our God, King of the world, ruler of the universe. What does it bring up for you? What does it make you, how does it make you feel? Does it make you feel connected? Does it sound like a God that you believe in or relate to or have a relationship with? And again, I'd invite you to put comments in the chat, or if anybody has a comment and wants to raise their hand, you could do that as well. Susan talks about rote recitation that is obsolete. Lee, hi Lee, talks about feeling distant, right? It feels distant. Do you mean, Lee, do you mean distant from your beliefs, or do you mean, say, distant from you as a person?
God is distant from me in this kind of prayer.
Okay, yeah, like far away from you.
Far away, yeah.
Thank you. Beck, go ahead. I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I was raised Catholic, and it feels very, like the start of prayers feels very sort of like Catholic to me in the sense that it's forced, that you believe God or you believe in God and all the good things, and it's just like Catholic Mass is just an hour of praising God, telling God that they're the greatest and the best. And
Okay. Yeah, so, and by the way, the Catholics in many ways have a lot in common with Jewish prayer, right? So the traditional Jewish prayer service, you're talking about God as a being, as an entity, somebody else out there that you are praising. It's also quite hierarchical. And I see some of that language in in the chat, a guy sitting on a throne with a long white beard, right? That's like a heavenly king. That's a hierarchical kind of God that sits above us, that commands us. Somebody said, I like the Hebrew poetry, but the idea of a king of the universe seems obsolete. That's a fair point. We can love the language. We can connect with speaking Hebrew and reading Hebrew and this very ancient prayer formula without necessarily connecting with the idea of a king of the universe. And I also see some Corinne saying the tune matters more, right? For those of us who aren't cursed to understand Hebrew, we can sing the prayers and not necessarily, I'm saying that as a joke. We can sing the prayers and not necessarily worry about the meaning of them or sort of explain away in the translation. So let's take a couple comments, and then I want to shift into looking at some different ways of thinking about what prayer is in Judaism. So we'll try to keep the comments relatively short because our time here together is short, but I see Susan, and then Paula, and then Bob, and then Daniel.
Well, even though I said this was rote, it is sort of a universal prayer language of Jews everywhere. So even if I don't think about what it means connection to the Jewish community at large. The other thing is, and this is probably jumping ahead to your next question, is when I start praying, I say, Eloheinu ve'Elohei avotenu ve'imotenu.
Mm-hmm.
Do I really mean that there was a God of our fathers and mothers? Maybe, but it's more meaningful to me.
Great. Yeah, I appreciate both of those comments. And I think there is something to be said for the connection of the words and knowing that we're saying words that are similar to our ancestors. So then the question becomes, how do we balance that connection with the notion that our prayers should also speak to concepts that are meaningful to us? So Rabbi Paula, go ahead.
So I see this formulation the way I see many parts of many prayers as kind of a mantra. It's a series of sounds that enable my logical brain to be busy while my emotional, spiritual side is able to connect with something bigger than me. The ground of existence, or however people want to define it. But I mean, I know Hebrew very well, and I never think of this formulation in terms of the individual words as much.
Great.
But I do agree that it does connect me with others who are also chanting this mantra.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, I appreciate that comment. How can we think about the words in more expansive ways that can help connect us, both with our own beliefs and also with others? I see Bob.
It's an incantation. It's a way of entering as a community into a process.
Oh, interesting. That's very interesting. Let's hang on to that because I think we will come back to those kinds of ideas. And finally, Daniel.
I was thinking about a book that I read, also like about God, if you could see it, a human history of religion, and it also tells there an allegory of how the first people became like monotheistic with children actually learning like what is really God, or getting the idea of like what really God is. And I think the context there that the Judaism was the first monotheistic religion, they need of course like the first like concept of, okay, what is a unifying God? Before was just many gods. Just see like the Greeks or the Egypt religions that you really see, okay, they have like many of like godnesses, and so and we have like one ruler, like that they could imagine of like a human ruler. And like for me, it's like this historic context that like influences the way that our ancestors thought of God as like a leader, like in the real realm.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that book is by Reza Aslan.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting author on religion in various ways. He's written on Judaism, he's written on Christianity, he's actually written on Islam. The point that you make there, Daniel, is important. I think that some of what sits at the center of Judaism and the center of monotheism is the notion of oneness, right? If Judaism is the idea that there is one God, then what's really sitting at the center of that is oneness. And many of you put the word one into the chat when I asked you, what is it we think about God? The danger, of course, of the language that's in front of us is the possibility of objectifying God. To make God one is to say, oh, there's one God out there, and his name is Adonai, and he's a ruler and a king who creates the fruit of the vine, who commands us things, who makes peace, who brings forth bread from the earth, who heals the sick, right? To think about God in those very personal terms sometimes doesn't relate to how we think about God. And yet the notion of oneness sits at the center of all of this. So the comments that all of you make, I appreciate, because I think it shows us that there's this long-standing multiplicity of ways to think about God and to think about what we're doing when we pray. What I want to do is I want to look at some writings from some both not ancient, but sort of pre-modern and modern thinkers, Jewish thinkers and writers and liturgists, to show us that breadth of ways of thinking about God and about prayer that is different from, I am asking God to do something for me, or even I am praising God for bringing bread out of the earth, which are, I think, only the very surface level of what prayer is in Judaism. So this is the Baal Shem Tov, a name that may be familiar to many of you. The Baal Shem Tov is best known as the founder of Hasidic Judaism. He lives in mostly the 1700s, 18th century. And the Baal Shem Tov, whose name, by the way, was Yisrael ben Eliezer, Israel the son of Eliezer, was in his day a bit of a rebel. It's funny to think of Hasidic Judaism as rebellious, because Hasidic Judaism today is essentially a form of ultra-Orthodoxy, right? Oh, can people not see my slides anymore? Okay, I'm seeing thumbs up. Most
Yeah,
people
they're still available.
I can still see it.
Okay, great. All right. So Hasidic Judaism today is a form of essentially ultra-Orthodoxy, but the Baal Shem Tov in his time was rebelling against a relatively narrow view of what God is, what prayer is, and what it is to be a good Jew, which had to do very much with study and prayer and following the rituals in the right ways. I'm putting right in quotes there. The Baal Shem Tov believed that connecting with God was in some ways very much about having a spiritual experience, about experiencing God. And the story that we're gonna read here, which may be familiar to some of you, gives a kind of a different view of what prayer is. Besides the notion that prayer is about me either asking God for or praising God for something. He writes, it is told that one Yom Kippur, a poor, illiterate young shepherd entered the synagogue where the Baal Shem Tov was praying. The boy was deeply moved, but frustrated that he could not read the prayers. So we have to take a step back and ask, why could the boy not read the prayers? And of course, we're not told the reason here, but there could be any number of reasons that he couldn't read the prayers. Maybe he didn't have much Jewish education. Maybe his family was too poor to have been able to afford to send him to a cheder, to a Hebrew school. In some versions of the story, the boy is a shepherd who has to spend all of his time out in the fields shepherding the sheep, and therefore he's never learned how to read Hebrew. Either way, what we have here is a picture of someone that, for whatever reason, is not fully able to participate in the prayer service because he doesn't know the words. The boy was deeply moved, but frustrated that he could not read the prayers. He pulled out his whistle and started to play, the one thing he knew he could do beautifully, wanting to offer his whistling as a gift to God. The congregation was horrified. But the Baal Shem Tov immediately stopped them. Now, imagine this is Yom Kippur, right? And on Yom Kippur, you're not supposed to play instruments traditionally, right? There's no, and Yom Kippur is a day of really solid restrictions. So imagine some kid in the back row walks into your synagogue and starts playing a really loud whistle in the middle of Yom Kippur services. Everybody's swaying and singing with their tallit on, and it's very spiritual, and some kid in the back is playing a whistle. How do you suppose the congregation will respond? Let's say, not so good, right? So the congregation responds exactly the way that we might think the congregation would respond. Get that kid out of here. Get that whistle. What are you doing? You're desecrating our prayers. How dare you whistle loudly in the synagogue on Yom Kippur? Immediately, it says here, the Baal Shem Tov stopped them. Until now, he said, I could feel our prayers being blocked as they tried to reach the heavenly gates. This young shepherd's whistle was so pure that it brought all of our prayers straight up to heaven. How many have heard this story before? I see a lot of hands up. Very famous story. Some of your rabbis might like to tell this story on during high holiday services. What's the message here? What are we supposed to learn here, and what is the story saying about prayer? I see Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
Saying that there are different ways to pray and that none are better or worse than any others. Different people have different paths to talking to God through prayer, and wherever they are seen as being by society at large, try again. They're right for you and they should be respected by everyone.
Okay. Yeah, so one message of this story is that there might be different ways to pray, different modes of prayer, that there is not necessarily a right way. The people in the room all assume this kid is doing it wrong, but the Baal Shem Tov sees something that they don't see, which is that what this kid is doing is prayerful. So I see Paula, and then I see David.
So to me, this has always meant that real prayer means finding the very best in you. He didn't read, the shepherd boy, but he knew that he had this incredible talent for playing a whistle. So it's finding something that is really unique and wonderful about you and sharing it with the universe. And that, to me, in a sense, is what a lot of prayer is like. When we say Modim Anachnu Lach, we acknowledge you. It really means I'm looking at what I have to offer back, what I've been given by the universe to offer back to the universe. Great.
Yeah, so the notion of an offering, right? We're starting this week the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, which is all about offerings. And the sacrificial language of Leviticus is often so distant for us. It's so hard to relate to for us. And yet the idea of prayer as an offering, I think, is found here. What's special about this boy and his flute? And I see some of you saying you think of it as a flute versus a whistle. A flute is more beautiful than a whistle, right? Either way, what's special about this? It's a talent. It's an offering that he brings to the universe, to God. Notice it never says here that he wants to say a prayer to ask God for something, right? It says here that he wants to participate together with the community, that he wants to connect with others, maybe with the universe. And so he offers his talent as something that connects him with other people and with the world that he is a part of. Great comments. I see David, and then Susan, and then Daniel.
So yeah, just to touch base on what Paula was saying, the way I look at it is he was doing something from the heart. He was trying to find a way to join in with the service, but in a way that was particularly special and unique to him. But as a pure token, not as a, just sitting there saying the prayers, reciting from memory. He was trying to do something that was for him, the best, like you said, offering, a
Mhm.
pure, heartfelt thing.
Yeah. So we have here a notion that prayer, there should be somehow personally meaningful, right? Which again, the words on the page that we looked at are words that are very much about, they are very much rote, for better and for worse. They're not prayers we wrote. None of us wrote Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We might connect with them because other people are also saying them, but the notion that there should be something of us in our prayers, I think, is also very much present here in this Hasidic story. Susan, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking about this in terms of last week's Torah portion, where gifts were brought to build the Mishkan, although they were defined and weren't just random, they were gifts. And then, of course, I leap immediately into Debbie Friedman. These are the gifts that we bring to make this a holy place. And that's what this boy was doing. And that's what the Baal Shem Tov noticed, I think.
Yes, I like that you brought up Debbie Friedman, because we're going to probably get to end with Debbie Friedman toward the end here. What we're going to do over the next 25 minutes or so is that we're going to look at a series of texts from different Jewish thinkers that I think are influenced by Hasidic thought. One of the things that the Baal Shem Tov is teaching here is the notion that prayer is actually about lifting us up. And we'll see that even a little more clearly in one of his descendants. But Debbie Friedman, who Susan brings up, is actually also very deeply influenced by Hasidic thought. And so in that sense, modern liberal Judaism also lays claim to the idea that prayer is about us in some way. Prayer lifts us up. Prayer brings something into our lives. That prayer, in other words, is not just about asking God for or praising God for. It's also about what it brings into our lives, how it elevates us. So Daniel, go ahead, and then we'll move on to our next text here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in my opinion, the Baal Shem Tov is like pointing to the meaning which you also explain of prayers, or in general like rituals of Judaism, like to its core back again. Because I think in that time people were more concerned about that they keep up with the numbers of prayers that they're doing, that they keep the Shabbat as like written down, but they then forget like the meaning behind it, that they're more concerned about following the rules instead of like getting like to know why they're doing it or what's behind that. And that he says, okay, the ritual has also its meaning, but the real essence of that is, for example, the boy who's playing on who's blowing the whistle, and even though it's completely against the ritual, like the rules of Yom Kippur, he's more on the essence than, for example, one who's just following it just to follow it. I hope I could bring my point clear.
Yes, actually very clear, and a really good point. That in some way here, for the Baal Shem Tov, prayer is about what it brings to us. The meaning of the prayer is inherent in, at least in some way, in how it lifts you up, what it brings to you, what it means to you, in that very personal way that sometimes involves connections to others, and sometimes also involves a edification or enlightenment, or sort of a lifting up of yourself. So this is from, I believe, this is Reb Nassan of Bratslav. We're still staying with our Hasidic theme here. Many of you have probably heard of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, very famous leader of the Bratslaver Hasidim, 18th century. Reb Nassan of Bratslav is his student. Nassan, of course, is Ashkenazi for Nathan, right? So Reb Nassan of Bratslav is a student of Rabbi Nachman, and he is describing here the experience that Rabbi Nachman and he would teach with regard to prayer. So I'd like to read, I'd love actually if there's someone who would volunteer to read this passage for us. This is often referred to as Reb Nachman's prayer, but it's actually written by his student. And the question is, what is he saying about prayer? What is the experience of prayer that Reb Nosson here is advocating? Susan, are you volunteering to read? Wonderful, thank you. You can read the poem that's on the page, please.
Okay, actually, this is one of my most favorite things ever. So thank you for letting me read it.
Great.
Master of the universe, grant me the ability to be alone. May it be my custom to go outdoors each day among the trees and grass, among all growing things. And there may I be alone and enter into prayer to talk with the one to whom I belong. That's another Debbie Friedman song. May I express there everything in my heart, and may all the foliage of the field, all grasses, trees, and plants awaken at my coming to send the powers of their life into the words of my prayer, so that my prayer and speech are made whole through the life and spirit of all growing things, which are made as one by their transcendent source.
Beautiful.
I would like to observe that I feel this even when I'm ripping weeds out of the ground.
I'm very glad you raised that, because there is a certain sort of naturalistic bent to this, right? He's talking about going and being out in the presence of nature, grasses, trees, and plants. And Susan is right to point out that, again, Debbie Friedman wrote a song out of this. It's called Reb Nachman's Prayer. I told you Debbie Friedman was a chassid, even though this class isn't about Debbie Friedman. She keeps coming up here. So what is Reb Nosson saying about prayer? What is he suggesting that prayer is, according to what he's written here? And does it speak to you? Do you like what he has to say here? Any thoughts? And again, you can put it in the chat or raise hands here, or raise hands if there are any thoughts. This prayer, Corinne says, this prayer was what made Judaism feel like I belonged. Wow, which led to a heart movement and my conversion 22 years ago. Wow, Corinne. And Beck says prayer is his connection to nature. So prayer, in Reb Nosson's words here, is about seeing yourself as part of something larger. He talks about going out and being alone. Notice, by the way, the notion of prayer as prayer being alone, and yet being connected, being totally connected while being alone, which I think in many ways is the opposite of how we are in the 21st century, where we're almost always connected, and by which I mean through our phones, but we're so completely disconnected, right? You have information coming at you all the time. You're available to people. You know, when I text my kids, I expect them to answer me back. And if they don't answer me back, well, that's okay, because I can check where they are anyway, right? Well, with my youngest, the other two have figured out that I can't do that with them anymore. But we are just constantly connected, and yet somehow completely disconnected. Reb Nosson here is suggesting a kind of connection through disconnect, going out into the world, experiencing yourself as part of the natural world around you, experiencing the natural world as God. And that's because he imagines God in a different way than maybe our prayer book imagines God. Where the prayer book talks about God as a commanding king, Reb Nosson is essentially describing a God that is the totality of everything that is. God is the world. God is nature. God is to be found and experienced in our experience of nature. And so prayer suddenly becomes the experience of connecting with that which is around you and of which you are a part, rather than an experience of asking a commanding ruler for something. Paula, go ahead.
So to me, there's a couple of very important pieces in there. When he says, may I express everything in my heart, and may all the foliage awaken at my coming. His being there is crucial in a sense to their flourishing. And then it turns around and to send the powers of their life into his prayer. So it seems like there's an interactive flow up and back. It's not just that he's there alone as a human being, he's alone, but he's definitely not alone in the sense of life being there. You know, when he says, may they awaken at my coming, I just have this sense of, you know, how often we walk through fields of flowers or whatever, and we don't pay any attention, but they're paying attention to us, depending on what we might say. And he says that when he pours out his heart, it gives life to the flowers and the field and the foliage.
Mhm.
And then when that happens, his prayer is elevated.
Yeah, I love what you said. And the question that is coming up in my mind as you're talking is, who's awakening whom here? He says, I'm out in the field and the flowers will awaken at my coming. But as you point out, Paula, how often do we walk through the world with our eyes closed, our eyes down? I mean, these days our eyes are often on our phones. I'll walk around and I'll see people walking with their phones in front of them. I mean, we are not really living in the world, right? And so prayer here, he's describing almost as a form of meditation, almost as a form of mindfulness, right? The idea of being present where you are, noticing the world around you and opening your eyes to the beauties of the world around you. My partner and I walk our dogs most mornings pretty early. If it were up to me, I would not be up at 6 o'clock in the morning, but she is a very good leader for getting up and walking the dogs at 6 o'clock in the morning. And so because of that, I actually see the sunrise a lot of mornings. For me, it's an incredibly profound spiritual experience to see the sunrise, because mostly we don't pay attention to the world around us. And Reb Nosson here is I think, encouraging us to see being in the world as a prayerful experience, and to see prayer as an opportunity to be present in the world. Susan, what's your take?
Well, I was just thinking that here in Tucson at this time of year, we are blessed with a profusion of African daisies, which may or may not be native species, but they're propagated naturally. And I have some in my front yard and some in my back, as well as a lot of other things that I don't like. But as I was weeding around the daisies yesterday, I noticed this little tiny purple flower that I'd never seen before. And I didn't have my camera with it. So after this, I'm going to go out and see if I can identify it and pull up some more weeds.
It's amazing what you notice when you actually have your eyes open, right? Susan Proctor, go ahead. Susan, you're muted. Are you able to unmute there?
Unmute works better.
There we go.
I'm always interested in the crossover between wisdom disciplines. And it just occurred to me the Baal Shem Tov's message is in the Christmas carol, The Little Drummer Boy. The drummer boy brings his talent and offers it. There's a Christian hymn, I Come to the Garden Alone, that is this same message that we're looking at now. There's an experience I feel when I'm driving to Asheville to visit my family when I first see those Blue Ridge Mountains. And I know there's a prayer for seeing something beautiful, but I don't know what it is. I don't want to stop the car and look it up. I just say, tote off of these mountains. But all of those things are bringing us to a sense of communion with the oneness.
Yep, agreed. Yeah, and so it's that I like the blessing you're saying there, Susan. Todah, Todah for these mountainite. Todah in Hebrew means thank you. So that the act of awareness awakens our sense of gratitude, which actually awakens our connection with God in whatever way we experience God or imagine God, and our connection, our sense of being part of something larger. And before we go on to our next thing, I'll just note a couple of the comments that are in the chat. Amy talked about the ordinary. This is an ordinary miracle, opening our eyes to the miracles that are around us every day. And I see the word awe. Awe and thanks are so closely connected with one another. And finally, to Perry's question, I still don't know if God hears our prayers. Susan, you got the right answer, though. I don't know either, and I don't think it matters. That to me is part of the point here, that what we're really talking about here is the question of what is the purpose of prayer? For those of us who are not so sure about a commanding God out there, what is the point of prayer? Marcia Falk, who somebody mentioned in the chat earlier on, is a liturgist. She writes prayer, she writes liturgy, and she writes liturgy and prayer that is intended to speak to the ways that we think about God. Her sort of magnum opus, her big book is called The Book of Blessings. And this is just one little snippet from the Book of Blessings. Marcia Falk, what she's done here is to rewrite the Hamotzi blessing. So there you go. Corinne's got the Book of Blessings right there in the room. So remember, most of us know Hamotzi by heart, right? Both sometimes in Hebrew and in English, we can sing the little jingle about we give thanks to God for bread. What does Hamotzi say? If we go back to our blessing here, Hamotzi traditionally says as follows: Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler or king of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. That's our Hamotzi blessing. Marcia Falk has rewritten the Hamotzi blessing as follows. I'm going to read just this one line, and then I want to ask you what's different and why the difference matters. She writes, Nevarech et ein hachayim, hamotzia lechem min haaretz. Let us bless the source of life that brings forth bread from the earth. So that's it. That's Marcia Falk's rewritten Hamotzi blessing. What's different and why does it matter? I see Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
It's implying that we are involved 100%. We're making a conscious decision to do something. So you're not dealing with any rote automatic energy. Plus, my impression based off grammar is that we are saying that our source of life, aka God if you want, is feminine in nature.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so Amy points out two important things. The word nevarech, and it sounds like Bob was going to say the same thing as he just took his hand down. The word nevarech means let us bless, which sounds like an active choice that we're engaged in. That is different from Baruch Atah, blessed are you. Also worth noting who we're talking to here. When we say nevarech, we're talking to each other. Let's get together and bless the source of life. And then, as Amy points out, hamotzia actually is feminine language. It's the same as hamotzi lechem min haaretz, who brings forth bread from the earth, only it's in the feminine. Now, is God feminine versus masculine? Is God a woman versus a man? Of course, God is neither and maybe both, right? But it in some ways is jarring. It jars us by using feminine language into realizing how often we use masculine language and think of the masculine as default language for God. Beck, go ahead. I see your hand up too. Oh, Beck, you're muted.
Sorry. I'm getting humanistic vibes from this prayer versus like reform, conservative, etc. in the higher order. Just the concept of like humanistic Judaism is that there's no, God's not acknowledged. And this, like, it's more about the practices and people. And this just seems like that.
It's an interesting question, right? And I think what's actually going on here is that there's an equivocation. That is to say, first of all, Marcia Falk has replaced the traditional Melech HaOlam, King of the universe or King of the world, with Ein HaChayim. Excuse me, Ein HaChayim means source of life or wellspring of life, and Ayin, the word Ayin means an eye or a wellspring. So Ein HaChayim, I think here could be interpreted in two different ways. It could be interpreted as an epithet for God. When we say Melech HaOlam, ruler of the universe or source of life, we could be talking to God. So you could capitalize source of life here, right? I didn't, I think this was my choice. I don't remember if she does in her book or not, but you could understand it that way. Or you could understand this as describing us praising the source of life in sort of the broader sense of the fact that life exists. But if we go back to Reb Nachman's or Reb Nassan's prayer about experiencing God in the grasses, trees, and plants, the question is, for a lot of us, are those really so different, those two things? Or are we experiencing God as the overarching source of life and source of the universe? So therefore, when we say Ein HaChayim, can we be talking to God or talking about God in a way that speaks to those of us who struggle with the idea of God as having a personal God, essentially? Bob, go ahead.
And the other possibility that makes this so much nicer is that, after all, bread comes from the earth, and everybody knows that the earth is feminine. And in the traditional structure, it is this masculine God pulling bread from the earth. And in this construction, it's the source of life, the earth, if you will, nature, providing us with bread.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's a little bit of an intimation of partnership here. The notion that we are partners with God in bringing bread out of the earth. It's a funny blessing traditionally, right? Blessed are you, God, who brings bread out of the earth. Well, it's like God is bringing forth whole loaves of bread out of the earth. Of course, we understand that that's a statement of partnership. Of course, we understand that God brings forth bread from the earth out in partnership with us. It's like the story, of the little girl who goes to her mother to say thanks for the sandwich, and the mother says, well, thank the one who made the bread. And so the girl goes to the baker, and the baker says, thank the one who milled the wheat. And the miller says, well, thank the one who grew the wheat. And the farmer says, thank the one who created the wheat. And so there's this sense of partnership between us and the source of life in bringing the bread that comes out of the earth. In a sense, there is this acknowledgement that humans and animals and plants and God, for whatever God is, if God as the source of life, are working together to bring forth bread from the earth. In the 4 minutes we have left, let me show you. It won't surprise you to learn I had about 5 more prayers I wanted to show you. We'll just have to do a part 2 of this series. Now let me jump to my final slide. Actually, I just decided something different. I just decided, since we talked about Debbie Friedman, to go and talk about Debbie Friedman one more time. This is a prayer that I'm sure many of you know from your synagogues. This is the Misha Berach. Raise your hand if you can sing it from heart. You like almost every hand, right? Debbie Friedman took a traditional prayer and wrote a non-traditional version of it that I think, again, is deeply influenced by this Hasidic idea of what prayer is supposed to be. The traditional Misha Berach prayer says, God who blessed our ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Deborah, David, etc., bless and heal those who are ill. So the traditional Misha Berach prayer, we are asking God to bring healing upon those who are sick. Debbie took that prayer and she turned it on its head. She wrote as follows: Misha Berach avotenu mekor habracha leimotenu. The one who blessed our ancestors, our fathers, the one who is the source of blessing for our mothers. And of course, in verse 2, those get switched. So you say the mothers and then the fathers. May the source of strength who blessed the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing and let us say amen. So this is another notion of what prayer can be, where prayer can be, again, about us and our finding strength and connection and partnership. Of course, in the second half of the Misha Baruch, you go on to ask for God to bless those in need of healing with refuat shlema. Well, I would say it's not totally clear who you're asking to bless those in need of healing. Do we bless those in need of healing? Does God bless? Does the universe bless? Do they find blessing? But before we can even ask for healing, we need to find our own capacity to be a blessing. In other words, prayer here is about lifting us up, finding our own sense of connectivity and strength so that we can go on to be the partners with each other and with the universe in bringing that blessing of healing into the world. So ultimately, I like what Ruth Bryn wrote here. You can see all the other ones I was going to talk about. Those will all be for part 2. I like what Ruth Bryn writes here in her poem called Illumination. She writes, I can begin with a prayer of gratitude for all that is holy in my life. God needs no words, no English nor Hebrew, no semantics and no services, but I need them. Through prayer, I can sense my inner strength, my inner purpose, my inner joy, my capacity to love. As I reach upward in prayer, I sense these qualities in my Creator. To love God is to love each other, to work to make our lives better. To love God is to love the world God created and to work to perfect it. To love God is to love dreams of peace and joy that illumine all of us and to bring that vision to life. So Ruth Bryn, who I think passed away in the last decade, writes to us about the various things that prayer is. That when we speak about God, speak to God, we're also speaking to each other. We're talking about our responsibility to the world, our responsibility to repair the world, to work to perfect it. We're talking about our own dreams of peace and joy. And she suggests here in the beginning that it's not God that needs our words of prayer. It's us that need our words of prayer. That when we pray, we are lifting ourselves up to connect with each other, with the universe, to connect with the divine in whatever way we experience the divine. So if I have to give an answer, I would say no. It doesn't matter whether God hears our prayers or not, because ultimately I think that our prayers, at least in part, are intended to help us to hear God, and to help us to be aware and open to our responsibility and our connectedness with each other. So with that, I'll end. I want to thank all of you for being with me here today, spending a little bit of time studying with me. And I will do a part 2 because we have a lot more to study here. In the meantime, I would love to invite you to come join me in about 2 weeks for a class about Shabbat, about experiencing or reclaiming Shabbat as liberal Jews. I'll just put the website for La Asok into the chat. And if you go to the current classes page, you can sign up for that as well. And again, thank you to everybody for your discussion and for exploring this topic with me. And I look forward to continuing this discussion sometime soon. Take care.
Yes, Dr. Koa.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.